This is the Hegel Forum. I'm Justin Burke here with Jersey Flight, and today we're going to be discussing a little known reference in Hegel's History of Philosophy, and it's to a bird. It's not the owl of Minerva, which I think is probably the most famous quote in all of Hegel, how the owl of Minerva begins its flight only at the falling of the dusk. There's even a Hegel journal called the Owl of Minerva, but that quote comes from the Philosophy of Right, and today we're talking about the History of Philosophy, which is not actually a book by Hegel, but a bunch of lecture notes that were compiled after his death. And in these notes, he's quoted as referring to another bird, this time the eagle of reason, and more precisely, a young eagle of reason. If you want to find this eagle and read the passage yourself that we're going to be discussing, you'll find it on page 81 of the Lectures on the History of Philosophy, 1825. This is in volume 1, translated by Brown, Stewart, and Harris. This is the more recent translation, which you can tell because there's a particular year specified in which Hegel gave the lectures. So you can tell the text is reconstructed from notebooks of students who took the class in that year. If you have the older Haldane translation, which I think is still in print, I've got a copy of this one. It's also in volume 1 of the History of Philosophy, and there they translate it as eaglet of reason, and that's mentioned on page 78. And if you happen to have the Knox translation of just the introduction to the History of Philosophy, the eagle of reason appears on page 140. So why is Hegel talking about an eagle of reason? To understand that, we have to back up a few pages for the context to see what Hegel is doing here. We're still in the introductory part of the lectures, which Hegel begins by saying that the history of philosophy isn't just a succession of random opinions, but the historical unfolding of rational thought itself. And he also distinguishes what is philosophy and what isn't. And the one thing he seems to spend the most time distinguishing from philosophy is religion, which he begins on page 77 of the 1825 lectures. Jersey, do you want to start us off there?
Yeah, he says, consequently, an opposition is found here. The form of philosophy distinguishes itself from religious form, and this distinction has to be comprehended with greater precision. And I think this is very important because he is emphasizing the necessity of this division, this opposition between religious form and philosophical form, and it matters because there are many Hegelian readers and thinkers who do not see this opposition. They see something more like a unity between these forms, but Hegel himself makes it a crucial point to draw a greater distinction, a precision between these two forms.
I think that's true. That's probably also true of the students in his class, especially in the early 1800s in Prussia. The undergrad philosophy students coming into this class probably thought that religion and philosophy were a lot closer together, a lot more closely united, as you said, than Hegel is about to. That's why he spent so much time, I think, separating, showing this opposition. That's how he even begins this discussion, saying there's an opposition between religion and philosophy.
Well, it's even unlikely, I think, that they actually understood. As we can read this, we can just contemplate the fine nuances of the text. We have it in front of us in a textual form. If you're hearing this in a lecture form, you're going to miss these fine nuances, and these fine nuances are quite revealing as to what Hegel's position is.
You're probably right about that. The students, like the students I said that came into the class thinking philosophy and religion were united, they probably could have gone out of that class too. You're right. It's not having the text in front of them to study it, to go over it line by line. They may have. You really have to have a broader awareness of Hegel's whole philosophical project. He's trying to give you a little glimpse of it here in this introductory class. But yeah, maybe the students wouldn't even have picked up on that. If we go to the next page, Hegel takes it to the next step on the next page, on page 78. He says that here comes into play more precisely the distinction between religion and philosophy. And he introduces this by saying that in religion, spirit has a characteristic shape. That's the distinction. Philosophy doesn't have a shape. It's not tied to what Hegel calls a form of representation, But what defines religion for Hegel is that spirit has some kind of shape. It's represented in a particular form. And a little lower down on the same page, he says what makes philosophy distinct is that in philosophy the same content. So religion and philosophy, again, if you're looking for Hegel saying that philosophy and religion are very close together, he's repeating it here at the same time that he's separating them. He says that philosophy has that exact same content as religion, but it's grasped as posited in the form of thought alone, not without having what he's calling a representation. There's no symbolic form to philosophy that you have that this form of spirit is tied to in religion.
And it's significant because what makes philosophy distinct is that in philosophy, the same content is actually grasped. It's not merely just believed in or embraced without this comprehension of it, this almost meta-aware comprehension of it. That is lacking in the religious form. And philosophy actually grasps it as though it's standing outside of it rather than just being bound up and wrapped into it. Of course, Hegel is going to expound this even more as this continues to proceed.
And interestingly, later on, he'll suggest that you can try to do this in religion, that have this kind of meta-awareness, but that meta-awareness is philosophical. It's not like it's almost like he's accusing religion of trying to acquire a philosophical awareness of itself. It has to use philosophy to become aware of it, to have this meta-awareness, as you called it. And Hegel's point is that isn't strictly religious. Actually, that doesn't exist within the form of religion alone. That's for religion trying to appropriate philosophical means of understanding itself. And I think he
and if
we're a couple of that we're going to get to that a little later.
If the religious form and the practitioners of religious form, if we're being honest, then we have to admit that that's actually a problem, that this form of religion is unable to produce this higher form of awareness or consciousness, but instead relies on this oppositional form of philosophy in order to be able to grasp itself. That is a problem if, from the religious vantage point, we're actually being honest about our ontology, because it demonstrates that there is an inability, an incompetence, a rational incompetence within the form itself, that it is not able to transcend, to emancipate beyond itself, but it's locked within its own formations, its own characterizations, its own forms of what it tries to portray itself in being a religion, basically.
And that's pretty much by definition. Hegel says, in religion, spirit has a characteristic shape. If you transcend that shape, that particularity that he's talking about, then you're not really talking about religion anymore. And in fact, if we go to page 79, he says, philosophy and religion go their separate ways. According to these two forms, that you have a form of thought and you have this form of what he calls representation. And so when he tells you how philosophy and religion are related, they're related through having this shared content, but religion's view of this content is tied to these symbolic forms of representation. Philosophy does not have that's almost a way you can define them, that the form of pure thought, pure rationality, this is the philosophical side, and it's split with religion. Their substantial content is one and the same, Hegel says. What differs is only the mode of its configuration.
That idea of substantial content for Hegel, I can see individuals from a naturalist bent, because I'm a naturalist, having an objection to this. But Hegel's position, as he states on page 84, which we might not get to, so I'm just going to quote from it. I think he uses two terms here which are very insightful. He talks about the instinct of rationality, insofar as he's talking about a mythological form, but he also talks about religions in the same passage. And then he talks about the reason that is becoming self-conscious. So he is really referring to, when he talks about this configuration or this mode, he's just referring to the fact that there is an instinct of rationality that's developing and the reason that is becoming self-conscious. Obviously, as humans, we're not fully developed in our thought process and our consciousness and our rationality. It's a progressive process throughout history. So when it first appears, it appears in different forms. It appears in more juvenile forms, underdeveloped forms. And I think that's really the point that Hegel is making.
Back on, where are we, page 79? So far, I don't think Hegel has said anything too controversial, except maybe if on the religious or the theistic side, they would think Hegel's drawing of this split, this divergence is too strong. Like, well, we have rational content. We have we think about religious, what Hegel's calling representations rationally or something, but Hegel's reserving pure rationality for philosophy, and he's saying that religion is always tied. It can't if religion tried to transcend its representational forms, it wouldn't be religion anymore. So maybe I'm too much of a Hegelian to see that as controversial. To me, that's not controversial. But he does come to a controversial point that we're still pretty far up on the page there, near the top of the page on 79, where he says, within religion itself, it is conceded, I'm not sure who concedes this, but it is conceded that many such modes of representation are not to be taken in the strict sense. And, okay, I mean, maybe not. But then the example, you see where Hegel's going with this? The example he gives, I think, is a bombshell. He says, God is said to have begotten his son. God is said. Like this is just something people say in religion, but this is not really. Hegel's saying that this relationship of father and son, of begetting and so on, this is drawn from living nature. This is from what is natural and from what is living. He's saying this itself, which I think is a core tenet of Christian theology, isn't it? But he's saying, well, this is what I mean by a form of representation. This is just like a symbolic form. It's not true. It's just something drawn, an example drawn from nature. This is how it is stated for the purposes of representation. And there's no way Hegel could have written this in a book. As I said, these were lecture notes. These were compiled after Hegel died. But to me, this seems very controversial, where Hegel says, one says it is not to be taken literally. What then is the proper sense of this thought category? The proper sense is that it is to be taken in the form of thought. We're supposed to think about this relation between a so-called God, a so-called father, a God who's a father, and a God who begets his son, and all that. But the fact that Hegel is saying these are just forms of representation, I think is kind of explosive. What do you think?
It is. It absolutely is, and I think that from
this really popped off the page for me. I'm wondering, like, what did that class think? Like, did Professor Hegel just say that saying God has a son is just a metaphor, or just kind of a representation of this naturalistic relation?
And that he also says, which I would take in a derogatory sense, especially in the time he lived, what then is the proper sense of this religious form? He says thought category. It's a thought category. This implication, as I understand it, is that, well, this is not real. These things are not
the
real.
Thought category, I think, is, he says, in general, it's something drawn from nature. And in particular, it's a family relation. But he says, well, that's true in a family when a father has a son and the son has a father. But he's like, in religion, in theological terms, it doesn't mean what it says. It's a representation of something else. It's not something that you would say, we actually believe this, in a profession of faith kind of way. Hegel's taking it as if it's he's looking at it purely philosophically, but I'm wondering how is one supposed to take this in a religious sense? Hegel's saying across the board, it's really just a form of representation.
All of the popes, bishops, and all of Luther's men would not make the statement that Hegel here makes. The proper sense is that it is to be taken as a literal truth. No, that's not what he says. The proper sense is that it is to be taken in the form of thought. It is not to be taken as this literal, authoritarian, imposing form. He he delineates to the side of philosophy. Which oppositional side is he on? He's precisely on the oppositional side of philosophy. He threw down a gauntlet, drew a dividing line.
It's very strong language, and I did add that in the margins. The proper sense that it's to be taken is philosophically. That what does that mean? It means not religiously. So religiously, it's as if Hegel's saying it doesn't have any meaning, because he's like, well, it's not a real father-son relation. That's something that exists in nature between generations. It's not something that exists between deities and their offspring or whatever, except as a symbolic form.
It's maybe Hegel. He's very lucky that his students are just sitting in this lecture because, they go back to their churches on Sunday and they say, do you know what my philosophy professor said, about the Bible, about religion? It's blasphemous. He said that it's not
very much a mixed message.
Yeah, it's very, and the word gets around that Hegel is preaching some type of atheism, some type of non-literalism, destroying the authority of religion. This is not good for him if people are thinking in these terms.
It's just amazing that we even have these transcripts, because Hegel, it's not like that Hegel didn't write this in a book. I don't think Hegel could have written this in a book at the time.
And what's incredible here is that this gets much more fierce. This gets
we only just got started.
Yeah, this gets so much more harsh, and it is amazing that people have not carefully read over this or seen this or commented more on this.
Well, let's so where should we pick up the next paragraph there on we're down 79, the last paragraph on 79, where he says spirit is only result. What does that mean? That means it's resulted from a process. And I think so. Part of that process is this religious stage of consciousness where we think of things in terms of fathers and sons and creator and created and whatever the relations are that exist in religious forms. But then he says later on, like after spirit has gone through spirit has advanced in this process of development. Later on, thinking grasps itself more concretely. Grasps itself, by the way, not the forms of representation. In religion, thinking is grasping, or really what the distinction Hegel makes between thinking and feeling. He says religion is based on feeling. We have a feeling about our families, about fathers and sons and parents and children, and that gets expressed in broader terms in the religious symbols. But later on, thinking is grasping itself more concretely, becomes inwardly deeper, and brings the concept of spirit as such to consciousness. Not the concept of God, right? Not deities and gods and goddesses, but the concept of spirit itself. It's coming to what Hegel calls spirit is coming to awareness of itself, to self-consciousness through in terms of a historical process. Remember, and that's the context of all of what we're talking about, is the history of philosophy, how this works itself out purely at the level of thought in history.
Well, if we back up just a few lines here, we see just one of the most devastating statements that Hegel has ever made against religion. He says, it is natural for these different forms and their initial determinate emergence to be aware of their differences and so to be mutually antagonistic. That is necessarily the case. The first emergence of thinking itself is abstract. Now, in Hegel's understanding, this is not a good thing because abstraction is empty. This is not a type of thinking that he prizes. This is very low level of thinking that's lacking determination.
It's the opposite of what that sentence I just read, where he talks about spirit grasping itself more concretely. So you're at the abstract level here.
And this gets so devastating. He says the first emergence of thinking itself is abstract, therefore not perfect in its form, and even more imperfect is religious consciousness, as it exists initially and immediately, even though it be a consciousness of God, of a higher being. But he says, even more imperfect than this abstract form, which is already considered like the lowest, most immediate form of knowing, even more imperfect, says Hegel, is religious consciousness. That clearly, his class is not understanding him, I think, at this point.
Well, I wonder what he means here, because he says, as it exists initially and immediately. So my guess is he has he's talking about a very early form, a very undeveloped form of religious consciousness, something where you might identify light itself with the transcendental, the light is a god, or the weather phenomena of weather are God, something like that. That's because he's talking about it being immediate. So you haven't even created a symbol where like a god exists independently of the world and created the world, but it's like the world itself is a god in terms of light and dark, or planets and moons and stars and whatever. I'm not exactly sure. I don't think he elaborates here. But when I see that word immediate, that's what I'm guessing, that something is immediately perceived to be godlike, rather than proceeding to the intermediary step where you have a god representing something rather than actually being light or whatever natural phenomenon is being identified with the deity.
So this is a reference to like the most primitive form of religion, as he
That's
says.
what
It
I'm
is
getting
still
from it.
intertwined with the sensuous shape in a sensible way. So the idea that it's just the most primitive form.
So the thinking is abstract because what we're seeing as divine is the most concrete. It's darkness itself, or it's the weather, or the sea, or a sea god, or it's like the sea hasn't even been personified in the form of a god. It's just like the sea. The sea is a god, or the sky is a god, something like that. He doesn't say, so I'm just kind of interpreting it here. But when I see that word immediate, that's what I'm guessing, that some natural phenomena that we perceive is immediately considered to be determined to be a god in some sense. And then he says that part that I read before, where thinking grasps itself more concretely, becomes inwardly deeper, brings the concept of spirit. So that, to me, there's like a huge gap between those two. So there are only like a couple of sentences there. But from the abstract, that's like a very primitive form of religious awareness to me. And then when he's this next one, it sounds like he's coming very close to philosophy, where spirit is grasping itself, not positing that there are gods and goddesses or any kind of transcendental beings. And then he's just a little further down, he says, spirit itself essentially conceives itself as having determination within itself. Very, very reflexive sentence there. But spirit itself is getting more developed. It's deepening. It's a lot of words that Hegel uses to describe this process. But it's something that gets worked out historically. It's not something that emerges. It goes from the abstract to the concrete, from the immediate to the mediate. The abstract understanding, just below just at the bottom of the page there, the abstract understanding is soon done with this, for it denies all determinacy. Then little remains of God. He's making this point, I think, on the next page, isn't he talking about rationality, like rationality in religion, or rationalization, something like that. Let's go
Yeah,
to,
I believe so.
On page 80 there. Later on, so he's trying to lay out a kind of historical sequence here. Later on, the concept, this is the concept in Hegel's sense of it, what's being worked out.
I should, before we move to this, I should make one more point in passing about this, just very quickly, about this primitive form of religion being even more imperfect is religious consciousness. Well, if religious consciousness does in fact proceed also from this, it's also a problem, because it's not like it's proceeding from something that is what Hegel would consider to be a developed qualitative form. So it's emerging from this problematic, imperfect religious consciousness itself. So it still has this problem going forward in its, I would say, deductive process, developmental process. As it proceeds forward, it's proceeding forward from the basis of this sensuous shape in this sensible way still. And of course, it's trying to break free from it in some sense by employing aspects of reason, but it's still tied down in some way to this sensuous shape in this sensible way.
Yeah, my guess would be it's no longer, Hegel's talking about the transition from seeing light itself as a god, and then we get this kind of intermediary period where we believe there's like a god of light, or a god of the sky, or god of whatever it is, mountain gods of mountains. It's interesting seeing the mountain as a god, and the mountain as being represented by a god. So it's still, Hegel still says these are all imperfect forms. They're all kind of abstract. They're abstract forms of consciousness that are getting less abstract. They're getting more concrete spiritually, because they start out being too concrete rationally, because you think of just you say a mountain is a god. Well, that's a very abstract idea of what a god is, because the mountain exists as itself. It's totally concrete. It doesn't really represent anything else. Then we get a stage where I think there's a separation between the god and the physical, the whatever the phenomenon is, the sky, the mountain, whatever. Hegel could have said more about this. Maybe he said, maybe in his lectures on philosophy of religion, he might say more about this. I'm not sure. But he's where are we now? We're on 80. Yeah, so he's later on he says the concept, the self-conceiving thought, presumably philosophy here. The concept is what Hegel talks about as unfolding in logic, and the unfolding of logic, Hegel thinks, is very similar to the unfolding of philosophical history. He often makes that analogy between the unfolding of logic in his Science of Logic and the way that philosophy historically unfolded itself. And so he says that the concept, the self-conceiving thought, recognizes in the content of religion something concrete. Well, that's very interesting, isn't it? That's philosophy looking back. Again, it's kind of like an Owl of Minerva moment here. Philosophy recognizes something in the content of religion that's concrete, something not sensuous, but something essential. God the Father is the abstract product of the understanding. Well, and again, it popped off the page. I think he's making that similar point that he made on the previous page, where God is the Father and has a Son, and this is just a representation drawn from nature. And here, God the Father is the abstract product of the understanding. And then, what is philosophy seeing in this? As spirit, God does not leave the other as something other. God is present to himself in the other. It's Hegel's kind of showing you how to do a philosophical analysis of religion here, in this case, the concept of a God. God is present to himself in the other, and this is spirit. It's almost like this is like right out of phenomenology. How do we become conscious of ourselves? How do we get self-consciousness? It's through awareness, consciousness of something else, and then we're reflected back onto ourselves. And that's what I'm seeing in this passage. It's kind of like God is going through this same process.
Just the metacognition that is only supplied by the oppositional form of philosophy that you pointed out, that later on the concept, the self-conceiving thought, recognizes in the content of religion something concrete. This is not something that religion can do for itself or has done for itself, because it doesn't have the philosophical power, capacity, or competence to do it. It's unable to do it. It gets caught up in its form, gets locked in its form, is a believer in its form. It doesn't have this critical capacity, this meta outside capacity analysis to be able to recognize or to draw a determination or a judgment that there is something concrete in the religious form.
And what's interesting is Hegel can't seem to resist inserting the philosophical interpretation. He's just supposed to be talking about religion, and he's kind of giving the game away, but that he's going to say later that religion kind of needs philosophy. Without philosophy, religion is just a bunch of symbolic forms, and that it isn't aware of. It's not able to understand what the meaning of the forms is. And Hegel's kind of is injecting this pre-philosophical, this pre-philosophical analysis of the religious form, the forms of representation that he's going to be more explicit about later on. This kind of slipped by me before in a previous reading that Hegel's actually, what I think he's doing, he's either giving a preview of it, or remember, these are just lecture notes. Maybe just Hegel couldn't help himself. He just wants to insert this at this point to give the philosophical analysis.
And as he says at the end of this paragraph here, this concrete element in religion that can then be known and recognized only by the concept that is itself concrete. Herein lies the possibility of the reconciliation of philosophy with religion and of religion with philosophy.
And whose terms are they on? It's on philosophy's terms.
Exactly. That what he's talking about here when he says can be known and recognized only by the concept that is itself concrete. That's not religion. He's referring to reason. He's precisely referring to the process of rationality that takes place in philosophy that has the capacity to take this critical, logical, evaluative stance of the subject, of the content, and to evaluate it in this rational way. And that here, within this power, within this capacity, lies the possibility of the reconciliation of philosophy with religion, not because religion has provided the means or the grounds by which these two oppositions can be drawn together, because it doesn't have this within itself.
It never rises above its own level. The religious level doesn't have that meta awareness. It's kind of, the winner takes it all in this case, and the winner is philosophy.
It would run on as a line into eternity without ever leaving its straightness. It would just flow down this path. But because philosophy has it's operating with rational capacity, it is this that wherein lies the possibility of the reconciliation of philosophy with religion. And that is truly extraordinary, that if we're going to understand these things in this higher analysis, then we have it here through this capacity of philosophical, rational philosophy, not through the religious form and the religious content.
No. And I mean, he's already told us what the reconciliation is, right? The reconciliation is the philosophical awareness that religion and philosophy share the same content. The problem is religion doesn't know that. Religion isn't aware. It's not at the level where it can cognize that. And Hegel's going to, if you don't believe us now, Hegel is going to say this explicitly later on, but he's really previewing it here. Like I said, I think he just couldn't help inserting this philosophical analysis in this particular paragraph here.
Well, and then he moves on to, this is the historical sequence, as he was just laying out there, this kind of process of religion developing in its quasi-rational process. At first, thinking emerges to some extent within religion, although in an unfree manner. Now, this is not good. This is never good when Hegel is saying that something is emerging in an unfree manner. Right. His entire philosophy is about freedom. So if it's emerging in an unfree manner, or side by side.
I like, even without that unfree manner, that's devastating. But even before that, thinking emerges to some extent. Like, so the most he's willing to acknowledge is that there's some rational element to religion. Just thinking emerges. It's not all baby talk or finger painting or whatever you want to say. There's some thought to it to some extent. It's almost like, it sounds almost ironic or something like that. Thinking emerges to some extent. He's giving it to, there's thought within religion, but it's only to some extent. And then it's in an unfree manner. Like, if you didn't catch it in the first part of the sentence, he really brings the hammer down by saying it's in an unfree manner.
The line from 84, the instinct of rationality, the child has an instinct for speech. This is not giving praise of elocution to the child for speaking. This is talking about the child as just not being developed, but
as pure potential. Right? The child has the potential to read and write and speak and reason and all, but the child can't do those things. The child only has the capacity to do them at some point in the future. Like that sentence you started out reading. This is the historical sequence. Hegel's just said, these are the facts, right? This is how it happened. Just like a child. The child's got to go to kindergarten. A child's got to go to first grade. There's an unfolding, a development. The potential for rationality, for reasoning is there, but you don't expect a kindergartner to be reasoning and a rational adult, mature person.
Well, another point I would make about this, which is a naturalist point really, is that it's one would want to take a position perhaps where one does not want to assign rationality to religion at all. But the reality is that it's a developing cognition within our species. And this is not what logic is per se. That's different. But rationality is a developing cognition within our species, and it's going to show itself slowly and keep on emerging and growing and building as we continue to comprehend logic in the world. And it's not going to show itself entirely developed or in an advanced stage of development, when it first shows itself, it's going to show itself in a very juvenile type form. And that's precisely what he's kind of getting at here with this. At first, thinking emerges to some extent within religion. To some extent, thinking emerges, although in an unfree manner, side by side with these religious representations. It's all really negative from Hegel's perspective.
If he had just cut that sentence a little short, because I'm trying to imagine the students in the class and also like the people with religious consciousness. So if Hegel had said, at first thinking emerges within religion, they'd say this. Look at Hegel giving all the praise to religion because this is where thought begins. But then he's like, well, it's only to some extent and is very unfree. Right, so it's don't get too excited by this analysis of religion. Yeah, thought emerged there. It begins to some extent, in a very limited way and in an unfree manner, side by side, he says, with religious representation. So yeah, I mean, the first thing you've got is the representations, and then there may be some level of thought about them, but you can't, as he said from the beginning, you know, what can't we? What's the definitional level here? It's that religion is defined by its representations. It can't transcend them. They can become more sophisticated, they can develop, they can whatever, but religion is always tied as religion to symbolic forms.
And what is perhaps scathing here is that this is not religion's own testimony of itself. That's quite scathing here. That
which Hegel's going to say later, religion isn't even in a position to provide. It can't provide that.
And it's going to refer to itself as being the highest point, the climax of thinking, the climax of freedom. All of these things are only embodied in it. So Hegel taking this approach to it is running absolutely contrary to religion's own testimony of itself. That's why this, I would assume, would be blasphemous if people are comprehending it at this time that he's alive, because it runs counter to religion's own assertions of itself and to both Catholicism and Protestantism, what they say about religion. And that's just downright devastating.
I think it would have been, if Hegel had published this in the book, I think this would have been the second atheism dispute. The first one, the only one, the famous one was, I think it was 1799, that involved Fichte in Jena. He was accused of being an atheist. I don't even think that was credible. I mean, I don't think Fichte was an atheist, but he was accused of it, and that was enough to have him banished from Jena, from Saxony altogether. But look, back to the sentence. We haven't even gotten to the end of the sentence yet. You know, so look what comes after the comma there, where Hegel says that the opposition does not yet enter consciousness. Not yet, right? It's going to. So religion isn't even aware that there's a tension, a conflict between pure thought and these representations. That
philosophically, you can only say that's a sorry conscious state.
The first sentence we read, Hegel says, there's an opposition here. We encounter an opposition. His point is religion isn't even aware. Religion thinks it has the same content as philosophy. But it doesn't. It thinks it has a monopoly on the truth and on, like you said, on freedom, on whatever. But it's not even aware that this opposition has not yet entered its consciousness. And then. So I think remember this is supposed to be a discussion on the eagle of the eagle of reason. I think he's and we're not there yet, but I think he's signposting the eagle. He says, then thinking gains strength on its own account, and so in its self-reliance. I think this is all kind of ironic, right? It's religion thinks it can rest on its own forms, on its own assets. Thinking gains strength on its own account, and so in its self-reliance it turns against the form of religion, becomes hostile to it. This is what we're going to see in when I think it's the next page where Hegel gets to the eagle of reason. But I think this is what that's based on. Thought turns against the form of religion, becomes hostile to it, and seeks to know for itself the concept inherent in religion. Again, it's philosophy trying to do the interpretation job, the hermeneutic job on religion.
There's a beauty of Hegel's rationality comes beaming through here, because when he talks about it seeks to know for itself the concept inherent in religion, this is precisely a reference to rationality, that rationality does not rest content with the religious representation. It doesn't rest content with this thinking that emerges to some extent, but the rationality keeps on developing itself as it must do, and then it keeps on pressing against the claim and the form of religion to understand for itself the concept that is inherent in religion. So it's no longer just being a passive believer in these religious symbols and forms. It has transcended them rationally and now is on this process of rational investigation and scrutiny. And
I think it's another, like, so I think he sees religion as one-sided, and then I think he sees this extreme this reaction against religion also as one-sided. It becomes hostile, and these are the exact same terms that he talks about, the eagle of reason, which is why he calls it a young eagle. It turns against the form of religion, and it's just kind of like a one side. It's just flipping to the other side. You've got you're immersed in religious consciousness without even being aware of what that is, and then the flip side is you're immersed in this rationalistic consciousness that's opposed to religion. It kind of defines itself in opposition to religion, and Hegel is also going to reject that. Both are one-sided. Both need to be sublated. I think he's going to use that. We're going to see that term. And
well, I would qualify this hostility. It turns against the form of religion, becomes hostile. I think indeed your interpretation of this is correct, of what Hegel's position is seeing this as one-sided. But one thing I would just qualify here is that interpretation, that this view that Hegel has, it works because what he refers to as being a one-sidedness is just the consciousness, the rationality that fails to grasp that religion, there's an instinct of rationality in it, in a very primitive process of development. And as he said, it's the reason that is becoming self-conscious. So he's just trying to see these grains of development within it to realize that it is mankind's emerging attempts. It's rationality's emergence coming forward slowly within the species. So if we just fail to see this aspect of religion, then we would indeed have a misunderstanding or a misrepresentation of it. I mean, a lot more could be said about this idea of hostility and this turning against religion.
Well, when religion gets sublated, it does get canceled. I think this is the moment of cancellation, right? It got abolished, it got annulled, it got nullified. There are a lot of negative aspects to that word, sublation, aufheben. But and this, what makes this one-sided is that the other aspects of that word, that Hegel loves to bring out, that this word doesn't just have a negative meaning; it also has a positive meaning. That we're not seeing at this hostile this moment of hostility. We're not seeing the positive aspects of the sublation of religion. We're just going through that stage of negation. So I think that's what makes it one-sided. What redeems it in a sublational way, sublatory way, is that we're going to see what you mentioned, the positive, where this thought came from. The thought didn't come from nowhere. It didn't come from outer space, right? It emerges out of religion. It's a product of religion. It's like the religion's self-development. Like that. This is what Hegel would say. It's not getting canceled and nullified and all that from outside. It's coming from within.
Yeah, it's hard for people to see what Hegel says on the top of page 81 here. At first, thinking is not independent, but is directly tied to the shape of religion. It's hard to see that if you're just coming at a later date down the evolutionary line of development and thinking about this religious form you're confronted with. But if we look at it in a much larger picture, then it's exactly what I was saying before. We see that things are emerging slowly within humans, and that religion at one point in time takes on a very high rational form within the species. That's precisely the way it functioned. And we're constantly developing, moving and growing beyond this as reason keeps on progressing. But it is true that this religious form, as Hegel is talking about it is true that it is an early form of rationalism that had instinct of rationalism, and that our thinking though we would not think this. This seems completely counterintuitive, I think, that our thinking is directly tied to the shape of religion, because these are the early forms where we're abstracting, where we're adding abstract determinations. And just, I'm saying this because if there's atheists or naturalists listening, it can be difficult to grasp this. One would just want to think, well, wait a second, this is not true. Rationality has just always been rationality, but it's a slow process. And early on, these were the most advanced abstract forms that we had. But Hegel's showing how we develop past them.
Yeah, exactly. It's developing in two senses. It's developing at the level of, you mentioned the human species, I think, so that across history, but then it's developing within particular forms, like on this. You mentioned the top of page 81, I think we're on, where he's talking specifically about Christianity. So Christianity itself undergoes development. It's one aspect of the overall development of humanity. But before we get to that, actually, when you were talking, it occurred to me to ask: does it seem like, is Hegel giving religion too much credit or not enough credit? I don't know. I guess you could see it both ways, right? I mean, the fact that he sees this kind of rational spark or this emergence of rationality out of religion, that's giving it a lot of credit. But then saying, but religious thinking can never transcend itself, because it can never fully be sublated. I mean, part of being sublated is getting canceled, is being nullified, and that what has to get nullified is those forms of representation. As long as you're stuck within thinking in terms of these forms, you're within a religious framework, and that's what has to be transcended. I think that's the message of this whole passage that we're looking at. So Hegel is giving religion a lot of credit, but I think from the religious point of view, he's not giving them the credit that they think they deserve.
Yeah, I see him kind of saying to primitive man, you think you're making a god, but you're actually making a form. And the form you're making has a nature, an instinct of rationality to it, but you're not aware of it. We're aware of it as rationality has developed. We can then look back and talk about it this way. But we're saying this to primitive religious man. You think you're making a god, but we know better later on, as reason has developed, that was us we were constructing the early stages of rational forms, even though we got bound up in the specific content of these forms, the specific identities of these forms. And that's what Hegel's trying to break free from here with religion, and point out that this is just not the case.
Yeah, well, it's not even that primitive, right? I mean, this is the case of Christian religion. This is the most developed religion. Hegel is, what does he call it? The revealed religion, or the one true form of religion, or something like that. And like he just said, God, well, they say God begets a son or whatever. And Hegel's saying, but that's just a representation. That's not true. I mean, I don't, go ask your pastor if he thinks that's true. Hegel's saying it's not. So that's even the most developed form of religion is not accepting on religious terms.
Yeah, it is. It's very devastating, because it is what he's saying about religion is definitely, like I said, not something that religion is going to say about itself or wants to say about itself, and nor do practitioners of religion want to say this or admit this about religion. This philosophical judgment and critique against it, which is just trying to be honest about these forms. That's why it's not just approaching it in this way of pure hostility, but trying to see it in a general sense, so it can grasp what this process was as a logical form, as a rational form.
And it's, like I said, so you have the whole development of religion from whatever, primitive religions and whatever he called them, abstract religions, and then they get more concrete. Then within Christianity itself, like at the top of 80, what page are we on here? 81. He says that he talks about the Christian religion, and he says within Christianity, religion became, so he means religion as a whole, became for the first time a system at the hands of who? The philosophizing fathers of the church. So that's not Jesus Christ, right? That's not the evangelists or the whatever, the early Christians. Like what the period of the church fathers. This is hundreds of years, 1,000 years. I don't know. Do you know what the time period he's talking about? Anyway, it's certainly not the original conception of Christianity. That he's saying it's undergone a lot of development through philosophizing, interestingly.
Well, I wrote in my little footnote here that these church fathers had actually stopped doing theology at that point, because they're the philosophizing fathers of the church, because he's pointing out that they have indeed brought in philosophical, rational type thinking and forms into theology to try to develop and continue to progress it and work with it. So it's not the pure abstract form of religion that they were working with anymore. Philosophy starts breaking into this religious form.
And look at the next paragraph where he says, in more recent times. So the church fathers, I mean, who is it? Is that Jerome and Ambrose or Augustine?
Augustine.
Yeah. In more recent times, so and he specifically mentions the Reformation. So he's talking about Luther there, right? He says, some have sought to return religion to its initial shape. Like I said, I don't know what, like trying to just read the Bible and pretend we live in biblical times or something. I mean, that maybe to just go back to like a pure form of Christianity without those meddling, philosophizing fathers. But then look at his comment. Although it involved this idea of trying to go back to the original, to return religion to its initial shape, this also involves the spurious sense of repudiating the elaboration, presumably of the philosophizing fathers, of cutting off the development of thought. So how do you go back to a pure form of religion? You've got to cut off the development of thought.
It's devastating.
You've either got to go back in time, or you've definitely got to stop this systematizing and philosophizing. And I just thought this was a devastating line here. To cut the only way to do this would be to cut off the development of thought, in Hegel's own words there.
Which would clearly be destructive to the development of the progress of reason in the world, of thinking in general. This would not constitute moving forward. This would constitute moving backwards and regressing.
Moving back in religious terms and in philosophical terms, because I mean the point seems to be that some people, I mean maybe not Hegel himself, but he says, they use the word here, some have sought to return religion to its initial shape because they thought it was too philosophical, right? It's not really. So some religious people say, well, yeah, we've got really sophisticated thought and philosophy. Look at us, and then others are saying, well, this is actually too much philosophy. We need to go back to the pure forms of representation right out of the Bible, presumably. And to cut off the development of thought. This would, to some people, that would be an advance.
I just wonder if he had that student who, when he went to church on Sunday, said, "Pastor, do you know what my philosophy professor just said?" Because that's what it's just, this is not, none of this is something that a religious person who is devoted to religion is going to be appreciative of, nor are they going to accept this as a characterization of religion itself. They're going to see it as an attack on the authority of religion.
Well, and let's look at the rest of this paragraph, because this is kind of how he's leading up to this eagle of reason. He says that at first thought elaborated the doctrine and developed it into a system. So that's got to be the philosophizing, right? The first point is the development. You begin with what myths, legends, whatever the Gospels, presumably. Then you elaborate this into some kind of system of doctrine and dogma and whatever. And the second is that the developed doctrine came to be firmly established and upheld. That's systematized, absolutized, formalized, whatever it is, within the body of the church. And upheld that thinking made this doctrine into the absolute presupposition. So by presupposition, I think he means the in terms of scripture or the
authoritarian, like an authoritarian.
That's the word
dogmatic.
he does use. I think he does use that term somewhere, doesn't he? You've got not only the kind of the basis of religion, which is supposed to be the Gospels, and then what everyone has thought about it and systematized it and absolutized it, and then it becomes an absolute precept. It's like it creates a whole worldview that everyone born into it is just supposed to accept. The forms of representation are locked in place, and everyone you get taught it, you repeat it, you read it again and again, and you believe it. Only later, he said, we're back to this opposition. Only later arose the opposition between faith or doctrine. That's interesting. Whether or not you believe it's true, the doctrine exists, and you're supposed to have faith in it. And so-called thinking or so-called reason. So-called, I guess because I think it's still his point is that what develops later is this one-sided reason. It's it's pure like it's reason claiming to be pure reason, right? To be absolutely opposed to this religious doctrine. So those are the two one-sided sides. You have the absolute presuppositional authority of the religious doctrine and dogma, and then you've got the other side that's the pure reason that's opposed to that, that's trying to reject the symbolic forms.
And then after this process, then thinking then posit itself on its own account. Then we have
As I would say, in a one-sided way, I think thinking posits itself on its own account, independent. Like we're just going to split from religion. You know, thought developed within religion, and thought's going to break off from religion and go its own way and set up this explicit opposition. So pick up with this paragraph here.
Thinking then posited itself on its own account, its raptor eyes are sharp, and the young eagle of reason for the first time soared up on its own into the sunshine of truth, but as a bird of prey that attacks religion.
Incredible. Again, I almost as good as the Owl of Minerva. Like, it's such a powerful image, but no one talks about this one. No one seems to know it even exists. I did a search on this, and I couldn't find. There are very, very few books that even mention this phrase.
It is shocking that this has not been isolated and emphasized by people because it's incredibly striking. But at the same time, this is perhaps not something that people want to emphasize because here Hegel is directly talking about reason attacking religion.
That's an interesting point. Every Hegelian is going to be, the Owl of Minerva is going to appeal to every Hegelian, not only as imagery, but for its philosophical meaning. Here, you're right, actually. This is going to have a partisan appeal. That Hegel's talking about this eagle of reason attacking a bird of prey attacking religion. I just want to point out in the translation, by the way, its raptor eyes are sharp. It literally in German it says Falkenaugen, which means falcon eyes, but I think that's which could mean falcon eyes, hawkeye, eagle eye. I think it's like an expression we would say hawkeye or eagle eye. In German they say falcon eyes, but it's the eagle who has the falcon eyes. And also I wanted to ask, what do you think in this metaphor when Hegel says that the eagle for the first time, it's a young eagle. It's in one of the translations it's called an eaglet, the eaglet of reason, for the first time, right? Not habitually. The first time, it's like its first flight. It's fledging from the nest, and what does it do? The first chance it gets, it attacks religion. But isn't the nest also religion? Maybe I'm taking the analogy too far, but it's like the eagle was reared in the homestead of religion, and then leaves religion behind, and then Hegel says it attacks religion. And religion's not the sun. I don't think it's flying toward the sun. The sun represents the truth, and it's kind of like it leaves religion behind, but then it encounters religion on the way to the truth and attacks it. Maybe I'm making too much of this. I don't know.
I don't think so. I think that's spot on. I mean, I'm sure people will interpret this in different ways or attempt to, but
for Hegel, it's just a throwaway line. He doesn't really explain it. He just throws it out there and he moves on. So we're lingering over it. And I was just wondering, I was trying to make sense of the different aspects, the different components of this.
It's so interesting that he didn't realize the significance of his own analogy. Of course, he just uses it very quickly and, as you say, moves on, but it is incredibly significant. And especially we just saw this long exposition where he's talking about building up to this point. So the interpretation where the nest is it's reared in religion, yes, this is all, we saw this from what Hegel's expounding here. So it's true.
Like, thought begins to some extent in religion, right?
The soaring up into the sky gives you this meta cognition of looking down, viewing everything from a very broad perspective, seeing it not as though you're a subject of the nest, locked in the perspective of the nest. You're now above it, looking down on it, which is precisely what he talks about philosophy doing in relation to religion. It's able to view it, but religion is not able to view itself, as Hegel makes this point over and over again in his writing. And so we have this here in this analogy that it soars up on its own. On its own, is referring, of course, to reason, though. It is soaring up through the capacity and ability of reason
Is that,
into
I'm sorry to interrupt, but you know what? Isn't this, doesn't Nietzsche use the same image? Doesn't he talk about the eagle alone and without its nest flies toward the sun or something? Am I making that? That's in there, isn't it?
my memory can't.
It's been a long time since I read
Yeah,
Zarathustra, but I remember something about the
the
eagle
eagle's in
without
there
its
lost.
nest. The eagle without its nest. So it leaves the nest for Hegel. We know what the nest is. It's the religious context that the eagle developed its first rationality in. We'll have to
It
look that up anyway.
it posited itself on its own account, not it's that's this is a secular project and justification that does not need to appeal to the authority of religious representation. The false authoritarianism, I would say, of religious representation, it's transcended that. So it posits itself on its own account, which I think, again, you can see soared up on its own, posited itself on its own. This is really, I think, a reference to rationality. The own is the reason. It's like a ladder of reason climbing upward. I mean, this is not a good to add to this because this is a bird flying. So the wings would more symbolize rationality here. The wings of reason flying up into the sky, and those wings of reason carry it upward so it can then look down and have this more sweeping contextualizing view instead of being caught up in the specificity of these religious representations.
Well, let's see where he goes with it. I still think that this is the one-sided aspect of it. Religion is one-sided in being inseparable from its representations, and then I think it's one-sided here again, where the eagle. Remember, because the eagle is immature. It's a young eagle for a reason. It's not a mature eagle. It's not engaged in battle. It's taking its first flight, and what does it do on its first flight? It attacks religion as a bird of prey. Like the very next sentence, the last stage. And I think a lot of people might take, like on the religion side, people may be taking consolation from this. Don't get too happy about it, though. The last stage consists in justice being done once again to the religious content by means of the speculative concept. When the latter being the concept has perfected itself into the concrete concept of spirit. So, I mean, he gives it to you. Again, it's like, it just depends how much of the sentence you read. It sounds like, okay, everything's cool again, right? Philosophy's done justice to religion. But then he says, only by means of the concept, by which he means philosophy.
That's right. Once again, this can be kind of simplified by the last stage consists in justice being done once again to the religious content by means of philosophy contextualizing religion. And we just saw how Hegel was contextualizing religion by philosophy. It was, in fact, very derogatory when he was talking about the manner being unfree, when he was talking about becoming hostile. He was talking about
God
things.
Having a son.
Yeah,
that's not real. That you have to apply philosophical thinking, rational thinking to the idea of the image, the symbol of God having a son. You can't just believe that. Hegel is saying implicitly you have to rise above the level of religious consciousness that would clearly be believing in its forms, in the symbols that make up its doctrine, its dogma.
The last stage consists in justice being done once again to the religious content by means of speculative concept refers to it is reason as well. This is not referring to representations. This is referring to the development of reason.
It's also dialectical thinking. When Hegel's talking about speculation or speculative thinking, he's specifically talking about thinking that goes beyond what he calls the understanding. The distinction is between Verstand and Vernunft, between what we call the intellect or the understanding and reason. So the speculative concept, that's only thought that can be undertaken by reason, by dialectical thinking. So
and we can.
So religious. He would say that. So religion has imagery, has representations that are dialectical in form, but it's not aware of their dialectical structure or meaning. Like the Trinity itself, like God having a son, that has a very particular dialectical significance for Hegel. But I don't think he thinks that religion is aware of that significance in a philosophical sense.
And we can say very clearly what this justice is that's being done to religion. This is actually quite destructive from the religious perspective, because the justice that's being done to it is not the exaltation of the religious representations to the highest place of authority. It is the contextualization of these thought categories to their proper sense, and that they are to be taken as forms of thought, not as literal forms. This is absolutely devastating, because the justice that's being done is not the justice that religion wants for itself or that religious demands for itself. That justice is where religion wants its position to be infused with authority. But that is not what's happening here. What philosophy is doing is removing this authority from the religious content, from the religious representations, contextualizing it within philosophy, and then saying, now you can continue on and carry forward with this higher form of consciousness that humans have reached in their development, and not partake of these abstract representational religious forms. Then justice has been done to your religion. It's been contextualized, put into its proper historical developmental place. Now philosophy has contextualized it. Now the justice has been done. So it's very important. The justice is not
it's not justifying religion as religion.
It's not doing that, and it is not trying to bring authority to these religious representations or a literalness to them. None of this is happening. It's actually the devaluing of it. If you're looking through it through religious eyes, it's definitely not the exaltation of it.
No, well, and the first stage of that justice, of bringing justice, is negational, right? Like Hegel said, God is said to have begotten a son. Well, the first thing you got to do is throw that out as literally being true. Hegel says that doesn't mean anything until, at a philosophical level, until we throw that out as literal truth, until we start looking at that as a form of representation. Once we're aware of that, which religious thinking is not, then we can start talking about what does it mean in what Hegel would call a speculative sense, in a philosophical sense.
Well, and he goes on, he further defines this by saying, so religion has a content shared with philosophy, only their forms differ, which means simply that the form of the concept is so far perfected that it can comprehend the content of religion. It's not saying that religion comprehends itself, or that religion comprehends the form of content or concept or anything. It is saying that the concept is so far perfected that it can comprehend the content of religion, which Hegel has been manifesting in real time by giving this exposition of how he sees religion as a representational form.
This sentence is almost comical, right? I mean, it's the way it develops. Religion, this kind of therefore, we're reaching a conclusion, we're summing up here. So religion has a content, like he's already said stuff that's quite shocking, and he's like, okay, let's bring it all together. Religion has a content shared with philosophy. Well, that sounds great, right? Okay, Hegel's a philosopher, and he's acknowledging this kinship with religious thinking, but then only therefore, it's just a little thing, just a tiny little thing, just one thing. Their forms differ, which means simply, I love the language. That's why I mean it sounds funny to me. Like this, he makes it sound like it's just such a small thing. You don't even have to. You might not even notice it. All this means is that the form of the concept is so far perfected. Not religion, not the form of religion. The form of the concept. Substitute philosophy. Philosophy is so far perfected it can comprehend the content of religion. And of course, the subtext is that religion can't comprehend itself, and it certainly can't comprehend philosophy. Don't even.
Which is devastating.
Exactly. And then he does it again. The content of religion shares with philosophy. The content religion shares with philosophy is most especially what we call religious mysteries, and then which appears in quotation marks. It's probably not in quotation marks in German, but we call these religious mysteries namely the speculative element in religion. And what he means by that is that only within religion, mysteries are are mystical, mysterious. That's why they're called that. In philosophy, they're not. Philosophy can just explain exactly what all that means. But religion is not able, it doesn't have philosophical awareness of what that means. It's involved in rituals and performances and mysterious symbols and mystical stories without being aware of what they mean. So,
Well,
again, the religious person might think, well, at least Hegel says we've got a speculative element, we have a philosophical element. It's in our mysteries, but the fact that they're mysterious or regarded as mystic, or there are all these related words.
Well, Hegel
shows that they're not understood within religion itself.
He says the mysteries are something opaque for the understanding, but not for reason. The mysteries are precisely the rational aspect of religion. Now, the point I want to point out here is that this rationality is so important for Hegel. And I'm going to share a quote from Robert Solomon that really drives home this point, because he perfectly nails when Hegel talks about mysticism, it's not mysticism. As Robert Solomon says in his book, From Hegel to Existentialism, he says, Hegel's mysticism is emphatically without mystery, and his reverence is without God. Hegel has an undeniable reverence for thought, for reason, for life, and above all, for humanity. But he is not in any sense a defender of Christianity, much less its greatest abstract thinker. He was perhaps the first great atheistic humanist of German philosophy. Of course, he says, except possibly only next to Fichte. But this is the category he places Hegel within, and this is how we've been reading him as well. Robert Solomon agrees with the way we've been reading Hegel, and what he says about mystery for Hegel is absolutely true. Hegel always sees reason penetrating into mystery and drawing out its determinations, clarifying it, and showing it in a rational light.
Yeah, in the encyclopedia, there's a footnote. I think it's Hegel's. I think it's his footnote, where he says that he's talking about that there is a kind of mystic tradition in German philosophy, like Jakoboma, I think it is. And he says, well, it's not philosophically speaking, there are no mysteries, because for seen in a speculative way or through dialectical thinking, these so-called mysteries can be understood. They can be understood rationally, while from the point of view of the understanding, which is a distinction I think Hegel's made in this text here, they remain mysteries. We don't know what they mean. They remain at this symbolic level, because that's kind of that's impenetrable or esoteric. While Hegel doesn't think there is any esoteric aspect to genuine philosophy, because if you're using reason rather than mere intellect or understanding, you will see through the mysteries. The mysteries won't be mysterious anymore. And I think this is a similar point that he's making here. That the problem is within religion, there is no speculative thinking in religion. That's philosophical thinking about religion. And to the extent that religion tries to use this speculative thinking to interpret itself, to achieve that kind of meta awareness, it's engaged in philosophy and not in religion. So Hegel is kind of saying it's inadmissible for religion to say, well, sure, we have speculative content in religion. Well, Hegel would say, well, you're actually importing that from philosophy. That's not religion itself, because religion always remains tied to representational thinking. It is not engaged in speculative thought, what he calls speculative thought.
What he says next, I see as Hegel attacking fundamentalism in what he says next. I don't see Hegel attacking rationality here. It's easy to read it this way if one doesn't read carefully, because you miss the qualifying term theology. He says, philosophy, however, is opposed to the so-called rationalism in recent theology that has the word reason constantly on its lips, despite the fact that its reason is only arid, abstract understanding, i.e., it is not a reason that has nuance and qualification within it. It's just operating on these very empty, shallow categories. No reason is discernible in it apart from the element of thinking for oneself. And here, that is just wholly abstract thinking. In both form and content, this rationalism is antithetical to philosophy. It has no content. It has made heaven empty into a caput mortem, that's deadhead, if I'm not mistaken, in Latin, I can't remember, and degraded everything to finite relationships with respect to form two. It is antithetical to philosophy. He says this again, for its form is argumentation, and argumentation that is not free. Hegel doesn't have a problem with argumentation. He has a problem with argumentation that is not free. And this is not philosophizing, not conceptual thinking. To me, this is like Hegel attacking this fundamentalist line of theology that's just holding to its dogma. It's only reasoning according to dogmatic categories that it will not analyze dialectically, rationally. And because of that, it produces just the same thing it is, more dogmatism.
Yeah. I think Hegel is attacking two failures on the religious side. One is, or two failures of kind of religion in general, I guess. The main one is the one that he's been talking about all along. I think he's introduced something new with this rationalism. But the main problem with religion is that it's, from the point of view of philosophy, is that it's stuck within the form of sensuous representation. But what he's talking about here in rationalism, he says that rationalism strips God into an empty, abstract, highest being. He uses this French phrase, right? Être, or is this somewhere else? I guess he does it too. Être suprême, the supreme being, and that's what he calls the caput mortem, or wait, hold on, am I pronouncing it? Mortuum? There are two U's in that, caput mortuum. That's just a leftover, a completely abstract remainder. You're just saying, well, God is there, but it's this purely abstract concept of just being the highest being, without having a son, right? I mean, earlier the problem, so the representational problem is thinking that God is a being that can have a son, which is something that happens on earth between natural creatures, not with gods. And then the rationalism that he's talking about here is problematic because it strips it strips away these forms of representation to call God this abstract highest being, which I think comes later. But he returns to this same phrase, the caput mortuum, the leftover. It's like a God with no attributes, no qualities.
And I think a simplification of this,
purely rationalistic God.
A simplification of this, for me, is just that these forms of so-called empty rationality is what they are. They're dogmatic rationality in the sense that they're not allowing their rational development to continue. If they were allowing their rational development to continue, they would not stop at these groundless, these very empty abstract points. So this is rather crucial because it's why he's charging these positions with not being philosophical, because philosophy goes into the concept to understand the determinations that structure the concept so we can understand the rationality that's built into the concept. But that's not what this form of rational theology is doing when he says the so-called rationalism in recent theology. That's precisely what he's attacking here. And it's just simplified for me in that it's not, when I say it's not philosophical, it means it's not going into a process, a rational process in thinking about what's before it.
Yeah, it's not thinking in terms of God as being a father and having a son. It's stripped away those attributes, that narrative, that mythology, but it says, but there's still a God, which is a completely empty, abstract concept. So I think that's the sense in which thought isn't free. It's still tied to thinking of a deity. It's like a purely empty, abstract theism. It's a theism that kind of exists for its own sake. It doesn't have any relation to anything. But so thought is stuck thinking about this kind of empty concept of a God.
I see this last paragraph really is like a closing paragraph of everything we've been discussing. It kind of brings it to a conclusion, and then he goes on to expound more about mythology and stuff. But he says, as conceptual thinking of this content, philosophy has the advantage in comparison with the representational thinking of religion, that it understands both. I mean, already this is, once again, philosophy has the advantage in comparison with religion because it actually has this meta comprehension. It, to put it in other terms, in relation to the young eagle of reason, it can actually do justice to religious content because it can understand both.
Right, which the eagle isn't doing. The eagle is that one-sided attack against religion, not realizing it just came from the nest of, if my reading is correct, it came from the nest of religion. Okay, yeah, it's trying to leave that behind, but you can't pretend like it never lived in the nest, like it wasn't, it didn't hatch in the nest and whatever that led up to its ability to its opportunity to leave the nest and to attack religion. Well, it came from religion. On Hegel's terms here, that's built into the narrative. I think that thought emerges within religion, but only a little bit, right? It does have to break through. It has to go through this one-sided young eagle stage, but it has to mature. I think it's important that the eagle is young and is taking its first flight when it's attacking religion. Not that Hegel wants to restore religion, but he wants to do justice to it, right? That's what sublating, what sublation is. It's not just canceling, nullifying, abolishing what came before, but it's preserving. It's lifting up. Interesting that goes along with the eagle, the eagle analogy, that the eagle metaphor. The eagle flies up, and built into the word aufheben is Heben. Heben means to lift up, to raise up to another level, and to preserve something there. Something that, by the way, did get nullified, canceled to some extent. It's not. Hegel's not saying we need to preserve the full extent of religious consciousness, but we have to acknowledge it. We have it reminds me a lot of what Habermas is doing in his history of philosophy. That he says that religious thought is translated. It has to migrate into secular thinking. That it's de-transcendentalized. The sacred is linguistified. He has all these different terms for this process that I think Hegel's describing here too.
Hegel is very much a Habermas long before Habermas in the sense. He's absolutely viewing the history of thinking and its development of thought very much in the same way that Habermas is viewing it today.
So what's left in this one paragraph here? Philosophy has the advantage. I mean, but my comment in the margin here was, this is all we need to know, right? I mean, you this one sentence, Hegel says philosophy has the advantage over what? The representational thinking of religion, and which it's not like there's religion without representational thinking. He's already defined religion in terms of representational thinking. There's really no way around this reading of this sentence. I don't think we're giving an interpretation of this. I think we're just reading what Hegel is saying here. Philosophy understands religion. He says it understands itself too, but religion doesn't understand philosophy. Insofar as religion occupies the standpoint of representation, it expresses only itself. And what is itself? Itself is the idea of a God having a son, or I mean, I keep returning to that. That was Hegel's own example.
It's very devastating to say that philosophy understands religion, but religion doesn't understand philosophy is truly devastating. I mean, this is epistemologically, this is a hierarchical confession that philosophy is standing above religion and contextualizing it and occupies a higher place of authority because religion actually has to look to it to contextualize itself. It cannot look to itself, and philosophy resides and soars above it like an eagle above a nest.
Yeah, he said the sentence that, Hegel's sentences are very long, so the sentence goes on. Religion understands itself in what comes under the heading of representation, but it does not understand philosophy. That is the concept, the universal categories of thought. And then he says, so people often did philosophy the injustice, there are a lot of negative words in this sentence, so you have to kind of turn it around the right way. People did philosophy the injustice of reproaching it for its opposition to religion. What does that mean? So it was unjust to reproach philosophy for opposing religion, right? Hegel's saying that it was a good thing for philosophy to oppose religion, if you turn the sentence around. Because
again, the student, again, is going to go to his pastor on Sunday and say, do you know what my philosophy professor said? The same thing is going to occur right here.
Now,
He just,
look, that same word shows up, right? Injustice. He said justice on the previous page, right? Philosophy does justice to religion. Now he's saying that people are doing injustice to philosophy for reproaching its opposition to religion. Because it does not understand philosophy, religion cannot judge it.
that is just absolutely devastating premise.
Yet the form.
Completely devastating.
So here again, the zigzags are just unbelievable in this paragraph. Look at what the next sentence. Yet the form of religion is requisite for the absolute idea. I looked it up in English, in German, actually. I thought this is a good translation. I like the way they chose the word requisite. What it literally says in German is the religion must be given for the absolute idea. It's a little clumsy. So requisite is a better form for the sentence. But what Hegel is saying, it literally in German, is that religion must be given. So he just really denigrated religion. Religion doesn't understand itself. It doesn't understand philosophy. It can't judge philosophy. It does injustice to philosophy by rebuking it. But then he says the form of religion is requisite for the absolute idea, for absolute spirit. It must be given. In other words, religion is the consciousness of what is true. This is very strong language, but let's read the subtext. I mean, after all this content of this lecture that we've been discussing, the subtext of this letter, religion is the consciousness of what is true in the form of either in the form of the false, or it's consciousness of what's true without being aware of it. I mean, take your pick, but I think it means one of, that's the subtext to that sentence there, one or the other. Religion is actually the false form of what's true, or it's awareness of the true without being aware of it. And then finally, the sentence isn't over, right? He says, religion is consciousness of what is true in the way that consciousness exists for all human beings. So I think this is actually, I don't think Hegel can have it both ways here. He's saying it's
derogatory. I would say the last phrase there, in the way that consciousness exists for all human beings, is derogatory.
Yeah, when I see that, I read lowest common denominator, right? I mean, that's kind of what he's saying. But so then is it really consciousness of what's true? That's what I'm saying the tension is here. So yeah, it is the lowest common denominator, and fine. In a philosophical sense, really only in a speculative way, is religion consciousness of what's true, but religion doesn't know that. I mean, Hegel, how many different ways did he say religion doesn't know that? Philosophy knows it. So where does that leave religion? It's the level of consciousness that exists for all human beings of the truth. So this doesn't sound very positive to me, even though I think Hegel is trying to make some kind of consolation prize out of religious consciousness. Yeah, it's true. It's awareness of the truth. It's just not aware of that awareness. It doesn't have the meta awareness. That's your phrase for it.
Yeah, I don't know if I can articulate this. Maybe I will dare try it. But if humans, when they develop a concept of God, they developed a high rational idealism, and reason occupies this form to a high degree in the world, in reality. Real reason, not representational reason. So when religion constructs these entities and these theological concepts, these concepts have specific entities attached to them, but that's not the point. The point, of course, is the rational or logical form that underlies the construction of these entities. That's what Hegel's really getting at. We've seen him attack the idea that these entities are significant and what have value. We've seen him attack this and point to the reality that it's just the underlying form, not to be taken literally, that is the thing that is significant. So for him to say that religion is the consciousness of what is true, this statement, I had a problem with this statement, but as I understand him, when he later says, all religions, no matter how natural, simple, or even childish they may seem, are products of the reason that is becoming self-conscious, however meager their religious configurations may still be. However meager their religious configurations may still be. So he sees this early spark in there, and he sees a form that has truth within religion that reason is becoming conscious of in a secularized form as it breaks away from this representation. It still, in Hegel's view, embodies it within its actual, the way it's structured, what it is in its logic, I guess, but all of the entity, the specificity of the mythology, the representations, this is emptiness. This is just
that quote you just read. Hegel says it's part of the process of becoming. Religious thinkers, religious practitioners, whatever they are, they would say, well, we're already at the truth, right? We don't need to develop any further. We've already developed. Hegel says this is just part of from the point of view of philosophy, religion is an intermediary phase. It's just part of the long process of development. It takes thousands of years, and religion is just part of that process. So it's certainly not negligible. But again, the whole meaning of being sublated is that you got preserved, you got lifted up, but you also got canceled, right? Religion doesn't just go on forever at the high level that it thinks it's operating on.
Well, this devastating statement by Hegel, which is so brutal, because it does not understand philosophy, religion cannot judge it. Epistemologically, this is a death blow to religion, whether religion likes it or not, because it draws a practical line that religion has an inability, a rational inability, to be able to make sense or articulate or explain philosophy, because it can't even explain itself, of course, which is Hegel's point. Mm-hmm. And so this is quite devastating because it leaves philosophy in a position of absolute authority over religion. That is what happens.
Right. Because from this statement where it says religion cannot judge it, well, the religious thinker might say, well, might try to have a comeback. And then Hegel kind of wins the argument by default, because as soon as the religious thinker tries to engage in a philosophical argument with Hegel, well, Hegel says, well, you're not using religious thinking anymore. You're engaging in philosophy now, which proves my point. Like either way, Hegel's going to say the side of religion proves his point. The religionist either can't engage philosophically, or when he does engage philosophically, he's using philosophy because religion can't understand itself or philosophy. It's got to leave the domain, go beyond the domain of religion to philosophy.
Yeah, other lines from this text that we don't have time to get to that go along with this, or a place where Hegel says the development of Christianity, for example, owes much to the philosophers. So even the development is because we saw him talk about the philosophical church fathers. He purposely called them the philosophical church fathers. He intentionally put that qualification in there because Hegel's very careful with his words. So he knows that even the development of Christianity had philosophy ingrained within it. Lines where he says this is not the form appropriate for philosophy. I mean, that's the point he's really getting at, that point in relation to this opposition, that this is true about religion. It's not the form that is appropriate for philosophy. And when he drives the point home by saying that it does not understand philosophy and therefore religion cannot judge it, that's a knockout punch, I think.
It is. And then he tries to recover by saying, well, the form of religion is requisite for the absolute idea. Then this section does go on for a few more pages, but I think there's just one more paragraph we really need to look at, and it's the one that comes after this statement that the form. He tries to give this kind of historical summary, I think, by saying the general cultivation, and cultivation, by the way, is this word Bildung here, which means education, formation. They use cultivation. It means culture. So a very big loaded word with a lot of meanings, and it appears twice in this sentence. The general cultivation of a human being, you could say the education, the formation of a human being, involves first, right, just at its initial stages, the cultivation of the senses, which is where religion functions at the level of representation, of feeling. Then, in the second place, the infusion or the this word here that Einmischung means like it actually is a kind of negative connotation. It means like interference or meddling. It also means intervention. Here they've translated it as infusion, which is kind of interesting. So, so first, when you're forming a human, you have the senses. Then you have the infusion or the intervention of the form of the universal to concepts into sensible appearance, the incipient reflection or apprehension of the universal. Isn't that interesting? So religion is based on what's a representation? It's a representation of a particular thing, a particular saint, a god, an angel, whatever. And then to go above that, you're going to the more general, the more universal level of concepts. Hence, religion, he says, must have consciousness of what is true, of the spiritual. It must. So he's trying to back up this claim that religion is consciousness of what is true. Religion must have consciousness of what is true. It must have the form of reason. Now that's, again, I'm getting a kind of mixed message from Hegel. It has the form of reason. What does that mean? Or my question was, if it doesn't have the form of reason, does it have no meaning or significance whatsoever? Is it just pure mythology where you believe God had a son and that doesn't have any meaning? That's what I was thinking here, that religion has this, mythical narratives and all that, and you can just believe in them, but Hegel's already kind of has gone beyond that and said we have to look at what these narratives mean in that sense. So you're not just looking at what's at phenomena, what's in front of you at the sensible appearance. You're applying concepts. You're going from the particular level to the universal, and this gives it the form of reason. I'm not entirely sure what he means by that, but so he continues. In other words, religion must be conscious of what is true in and for itself. Well, he said that above, that religion is consciousness of what is true, with the implication that it's not really aware of what this truth is, because it's stuck perceiving or conceiving of the truth in this insensuous form of representation. And finally, on page 83 here, this is the general justification. Again, we're like doing justice to religion, to the shape of religion, by saying it's got this form of reason. So my comment on this was that religion has no justification merely in the form of religion, which would be pure mythology, but must be justified by philosophy. That's what I take from this. Again, I think that Hegel is layering out the only way to justify, to do justice to religion, to see it as requisite to the absolute idea, is to give it this philosophical interpretation. And he goes on. I mean, the last sentence of that paragraph there: speculative consideration is not the general form of thinking for everyone. I think that proves my point. Hegel just did the philosophical analysis at the level of speculative thinking, and he says, but this is not the form of thinking for everyone. So not everyone can justify religion, not everyone can understand religion. So religion is left in this intermediary period, this intermediary place, as this representational form of what's true, without being aware of its representational nature, of thinking that God has a son and just stopping there.
Yeah, when I saw this speculative consideration is not the general form of thinking for everyone, I immediately thought that, well, he must be referring to the development of determinations of concepts, and that religion it embodies a high level of conceptual rationality that seems totally contradictory. I can understand that. That does not seem like an accurate statement. If I was to put that before a group of many a naturalist, I think they would not find that to be sound. However, in this sense, the way Hegel means it, it is quite sound, because all that means is that the religious form it embodies multiple layers of abstraction, but it's not conscious of this. Its form, it uses religious form to mimic speculative thinking, more or less, so that the speculative considerations require comprehending and developing different determinations within a concept. And if that's not happening, then you don't have speculative capacity or speculative consideration, and you're, I guess, maybe stuck with religious, a shape of religious form, perhaps. I
I
don't
think so. Like
whether
he says
this.
at the beginning of that paragraph, first, when in the formation of a human, first you cultivate the senses. That's Hegel has said again, and I don't think there's any ambiguity about that. Religion exists at that level of the senses, of the forms of representation, symbolic forms. Then he says you go above that to what he calls incipient reflection or apprehension of the universal. So I guess so. Once you totally cross over to universal forms of thought, that you're definitely in the domain of philosophy. I think he's trying to identify this intermediary. This is how thought emerges out of, in a low level way or whatever he said, out of religion. So I think he's trying to give religion its due, that there is an incipient reflection or apprehension of the universal within the symbolic forms of representation in religion, but nowhere near the level of pure thought that you would find in philosophy, because as long as you're dealing with religion, you're stuck with these forms of representation. You can't transcend them. You can try to, and then you can cut loose like the young eagle of reason and just turn against them completely and attack religion. But then I think Hegel is trying to make the best case he can for the origin of this kind of universal philosophical, what he called, I mean, he does use the word speculative here too, I think, right? Speculative thinking arising out of religion, but religion now, once it's fully developed, it's definitely separate from religion, and it's able to reflect upon religion in a way that religion isn't able to reflect upon itself. That's what I'm taking from this final paragraph.
Yeah, it doesn't have this ability to have this meta comprehension.
And then he has to come to this he has to make this disappointing conclusion. Speculative consideration is not the general form of thinking for everyone. It's like tough for religion, right? But we're not in a religion class here, right? Remember, we have to remember the context is that Hegel is introducing his history of philosophy. So now he's ready to begin. He's really made the separation, the distinction between philosophy and religion that maybe his students came in thinking wasn't so great, that there must be a lot of overlap between philosophy and religion. Hegel thinks he's really separated them here. He's made the best case he can for religion, but said in the end, speculative thinking, philosophy is not the form of thinking for everyone. And then he concludes by saying, we have now analyzed the distinction between philosophy and religion.
That's kind of a harsh truth in and of itself, beyond even the conversation of religion, that speculative consideration is, because it really presupposes and requires education. It honestly does, because you have to be
formation. I mean, that's definitely the context he's discussing it in here.
Ideally, we would want to have a development within our species where speculative capacity, comprehension, consideration, speculative criticality was in fact available and the form of thinking for everyone. We would want this, but it is not exactly the case given the type of systems that we have at present.
No, and I think it brings us back to the beginning, where I mentioned the Owl of Minerva. That is the significance of the Owl of Minerva in Hegel. Hegel can't say here, well, I hope in the future everyone's going to have speculative thinking. He's just making a matter-of-fact statement about today. This is his assessment. Religious thinking, representational thinking, the understanding, that's pretty much everyone can do that. This dialectical thought, speculative, what he's calling speculative consideration here, that's something rare. That's you. In this class, that's what we're going to do together. We're going to look at the historical development of this. It's unfolding over 2,000 or 3,000 years in the class on the history of philosophy. So it's kind of inspiring. It's kind of depressing in a sense, but because of the Owl of Minerva clause, Hegel can't make a future. He can't make a claim about the future ability of the general thought patterns of the citizenry. But that's what we're doing. We're not limited by the Owl of Minerva clause, but we can't attribute those thoughts to Hegel.
Yeah, it's a powerful polemic where it goes against religion with great force, and it's something that's very obscure within Hegel readings and Hegel communities. You really never see it anywhere, and yet it has a lot to say and a great deal of contextualizing. this entire text on this first volume on the lectures on the history of philosophy that's translated and edited by Robert F. Brown. This is one of my favorite volumes that I've ever read by Hegel. It's very enjoyable, and it's compacted, and because he's dealing with philosophy, and this is mainly just introductions, so it's sweeping overviews, and you get a lot of tremendous ideas in here and a lot of clarity regarding his own philosophy.
Yeah, and one of the other translations I mentioned is the Knox one. That's the one I read as a student, and that's where they just separated the introduction and published that as a separate book, the introduction to these lectures. And it's not a reconstruction of this particular year of 1825. That was just the way they published it after Hegel died, and they just edited a bunch of different material together from different years. But I do remember it having that strength and power as well, and also this kind of polemic against the representational thinking of religion. That really stood out to me at that time. It was a long time ago when I read that, and I think the language might even be a little stronger in that original version, the posthumous lectures that came out after Hegel's death. All right, well, I think we've gotten to the end of this topic anyway. Hegel does go on to talk a little bit more about, I think, what does he say? He's talking about, is there more about mysteries and mythology and that kind of thing? He does some more distinguishing again. So he's really, the big distinction he wanted to make was between philosophy and religion. There are other things that he distinguishes from philosophy. There's natural science, like philosophy of science. There's one of Hegel's pet peeves is popular philosophy, what he calls the popular philosophy of the day, that he at any opportunity he likes to deride what passes for philosophy in popular society, and he mentions that as well. We're not going to be talking about the history of popular philosophy. He also distinguishes philosophy from just the history of philosophy from random collection of ideas. This is not just a catalog of different ideas that people had at different times. He sees the history of philosophy as the development of this one, what he calls the concept, this unfolding of the concept of that's understood speculatively at the end of its developmental process, and that's what takes place over 3 volumes. This is the class that Hegel gave second most. The course he taught the most was logic. The second most commonly taught class that he did was the history of philosophy. And they also, after his death, had the most material. That's why this is 3 volumes. There's nothing else in Hegel's work that takes up 3 volumes in terms of the lectures. So they had the most material on this subject to...
Well, I think there's one fitting quote to close with by Robert Solomon as well. And he says that Hegel does make peace with religion, but only that peace which emerges after a decisive battle and a devastating victory, the peace that followed the destruction of Troy. Enemies alive are objects of scorn, but enemies defeated are not only accepted, but may be safely celebrated in their praise. The phenomenology constitutes such a thorough victory over the forces of Christian theology that Hegel can easily afford to allow its emaciated veterans to sit at the foot of absolute truth, honoring them only so that he may be seen merciful as well as victorious.
That's
it really does kind of summarize when you go through all of what he's saying there.
What did he say? The peace of Troy, that's when there's been an absolute wipeout, right? I mean, that's the image. It's like the peace of Hiroshima. Is that kind of something he could have said?
Yeah, now that you have been conquered and destroyed by philosophy, now we will make peace. Peace will be made with you, and you can enter into the fold in the context of philosophy anew.
Very near... So people may be wondering, wow, did we really dig this up out of nowhere? Well, yeah, I mean, I don't think enough people pay attention to this passage, but it appears something very, very similar wording appears in the encyclopedia in volume 3, which is called The Philosophy of Mind or The Philosophy of Spirit. It's part 3 of the encyclopedia. In paragraph 573, so you're very close to the end, Hegel says that philosophy can indeed recognize its own forms in the categories of the religious mode of representation, and thus also its own content in religious content, and do justice. There's that word again. It can do justice. Philosophy does justice to religious content. But the converse does not hold. since
Mm.
the religious mode of representation does not apply the critique of thought to itself and does not comprehend itself. So we didn't even need to talk about the eagle of reason. There it is in the encyclopedia in very devastating terms. Solomon could almost have been talking about that.
And that's important because it shows a consistency throughout Hegel's work. I feel very comfortable talking about this because I've seen this. I know you've seen it too, over and over again. This is not just an isolated case, an idiosyncratic, a bad year Hegel had where he was mad at religion. Hegel has this consistency of this critical approach over and over again. And you just read another passage right there, a very powerful and devastating one. The converse does not hold.
Which is very surprising, because there are, we've discussed this, right? There are some Hegel scholars, some interpreters of Hegel who want to see, like they miss this point. I don't know, they didn't see this paragraph, they didn't read these lectures. They think that Hegel, they're justified in saying that for Hegel, religion and philosophy are on equal footing, or to some, I mean, I've seen this you know what I'm talking about. That
yes,
there
absolutely.
are some people who interpret Hegel as believing that religion actually supersedes philosophy, because religion embodies this living tradition. It's kind of, Hegel says it has the same content. He said it again in that paragraph from the encyclopedia. Religion, it's the exact same content of philosophy. It's just a different form. And what comes along with religion is the community and the ritual and the liveliness of the. It's like philosophy is just something you read alone in a book, but religion is a community, and it's got this living tradition and history, and that's why some people think they're justified in saying that they get this. They think that they can interpret Hegel as suggesting that religion comes out ahead of philosophy because it's got this liveliness to it, this living embodiment in the religious community and practice of the cultus.
Religion did not rise up from its nest on wings of reason. The converse does not hold, as Hegel says. So this approach, and yes, people take this approach, it does not hold in the consistent articulation and exposition of Hegel. This is not the view he held to. He's very clear over and over again about this hierarchy between philosophy and religion.
Yeah, it's not our interpretation. We're not doing a reading of Hegel other than reading Hegel's actual words, right? I mean, there's a difference between doing a theological or an anti-theological reading of Hegel. We're not doing that. We're reading Hegel's actual words. And I think that other people who have published this interpretation, the religious interpretation, appears in books. And I don't mean like the old Hegelians or the right Hegelians from back in the 1800s. I mean people in the 20th century, maybe I think even in the 21st century. I've seen this interpretation of Hegel where philosophy and religion are equal, or religion even pulls out ahead because of its whatever it is, because of the community and tradition of religion being alive in the present day. That religion, there are plenty of dead religions, but they're still live religions, and therefore we get to see them like they've kind of triumphed over. Have they triumphed over philosophy? I don't know. They've triumphed over philosophy in the fact that they're still around, even though philosophy would claim to have sublated them. Well, and there are still some religions. Habermas has a word for that, right? He calls it the post-secular. That we're in this, that there was this kind of period of secularity, but religion is still here, and we have to deal with it, and we call it the post-secular.
That's the attempted reading of Hegel's philosophy, is to try to infuse it into some type of post-secular interpretation. And I just don't see it holding if one is going to read it honestly. And it certainly does not hold rationally, because Hegel's not just making these points out of his bias. He's just following the development of reason where it goes. And he's allowing, in his terms, the consciousness of the spirit as it's unfolding of rationality to clarify what the context of religion is. The eagle is flown up in the air, and he's trying to, at the same time, bring a broader understanding how religion and philosophy still fit into a larger picture of development where they have a connection still through their progressive development. But nonetheless, this is a rational position that Hegel's putting forth, it's not just his bias or his preference. This means that all of the dots are connected. And when the argument is made at the end of the day, it's not just an opinion that the religious position, the converse does not hold. It's not, that's, Hegel wasn't just saying the converse doesn't hold because he's mad at religion or he's a Lutheran. He's just trying to be honest with where the reason is leading and the rationality leads, and the converse does not hold, meaning the post-secular attempt to interpret Hegel this way cannot actually sustain its case. It breaks down on the basis of dialectic analysis, on the basis of rational analysis. And so there's nothing to it in that sense. And that's, I think, an important point to make, that it's not just an arbitrary declaration, but that Hegel has arrived at this point through careful thinking.
And he's expressed himself in multiple places. We're not taking a footnote out of context, or we're just looking at one student's notebook from a particular time. This appears again and again. It appeared in the encyclopedia. I think a good quote to end on might be another quote from the encyclopedia. This is paragraph 384, also in the Philosophy of Mind, where Hegel says that the one nature of God has first been revealed by the Christian religion. So again, he's giving it to you and he's going to take it away, right? So that's why I alluded to that earlier, where Hegel thinks that Christianity, he calls it the revealed religion, or the true form of religion, the fully developed religion. The one nature of God has first been revealed by the Christian religion. This content, given in the mode of representation, has to be raised by philosophy into the form of the concept or of absolute knowledge, which is the highest revelation of that content.
Luther would have understood this, and he would call it blasphemy. He would say that's nonsense. I mean, because he would absolutely grasp this. Right. Any person who's a fundamentalist, and they would precisely see what's going on here. Right. It completely strips religion of all of its authority and leaves it in the hands of philosophy.
Philosophy is the highest revelation of that content. Is there any other way? Are we doing an anti-religious reading of Hegel? Or I think we're just reading the words of Hegel, and it's pretty clear what they mean. Hegel has a reputation for being very difficult. What Bertrand Russell said, he's the hardest philosopher in the world to understand. I don't think it's hard to understand. Well, we've done a very careful text-based discussion of this subject matter. At every point, we've been reading sentences, statements, and even in this case, published text, the encyclopedia of Hegel. And I think his meaning is clear. I don't think now there is some ambiguity. I think we both expressed, maybe we don't know what this sentence means or that one, but I think the overall meaning is quite clear, especially when we see it in these different contexts, in these lectures and in the encyclopedia.
Hegel's the one that talks about the opposition. He's the one that draws the hierarchy. He's the one that says the converse doesn't hold. We didn't say this. We're not saying this. He's the one saying this. So he's the one rationally contextualizing religion like this in this derogatory way over and over again. He's the one doing this. We're not doing this. We're just kind of marveling that he's doing this. And so this is not contrived. This is, in fact, Hegel himself articulating himself very clearly. One of the amazing things about Hegel is just how carefully he used words. It truly is extraordinary, because he was such an educated and intelligent man, and his usage of words is incredible. He does not use them in a poetical way or in a arbitrary way. He tries to use them as exactly and precisely as he can, so that logical meaning, can be drawn from his sentences.
And even this, ostensibly, this whole talk was about the young eagle of reason. Well, look, Hegel doesn't stop. That is the one-sided view. Which, of course, is not going to be Hegel's view. Hegel's not going to settle on a one-sided view. The young eagle of reason attacks religion. Hegel isn't attacking religion. Hegel is sublating religion, or shows how religion sublates itself in a reflexive way. That thought emerges out of religion, and kind of like the eagle, it does leave the nest. It does attack religion, but then it comes back. It realizes that it did originate in religion. It cancels. It picks up, it preserves, it raises up, it does all this. If you look up the word Aufheben in the dictionary, it has all these contradictory meanings, this plurality of meanings, which Hegel loves to mention in The science of logic, I think, is the place he does it the most. And I think we're seeing that in terms of religion here. It's not just getting canceled out. It is getting preserved. It is getting raised up. And and we're literally raised up in the form of this eagle, but not staying at that as a bird of prey, as a raptor, but going beyond even that stage to see the speculative, what he would call the speculative moment, the speculative content that's there in religion that religion itself isn't aware of, which I think is what we just saw in those last two quotes from the encyclopedia, that the philosophy provides the highest revelation. Religious, the language couldn't be more religious, but it's in the context of philosophy. The highest revelation of that content isn't actually religion, it's in philosophy.
Well, the owl of Minerva has been famous. It's the most famous symbol in Hegelianism, but really the young eagle of reason should occupy a very important place in Hegelian thought. Hopefully it will.
Especially in terms of this discussion, a discussion that even seasoned Hegelians don't seem to be aware. They think that religion and philosophy have some equal standing. I think this whole any consideration of this eagle of reason metaphor shows that's not where Hegel ends up. So I think we'll conclude it there, with philosophy being the highest. We give the last word to the encyclopedia. Philosophy is the highest revelation of that content, that representational content that we find in religion, and we'll end it there this time on the Hegel Forum.